Cuban chair to eliminate stupid patents for one more day.
One more day.
As of tomorrow, I guess officially, I'm leaving to join Engine, to join Mike at Engine. I'm going to be his boss.
Yay!
So why don't we go around and say, and I should also say that I'm obviously interested in the patent space. I mean, that's not only my job, but I was a litigator in private practice before. I'm a patent lawyer. I think like a lot of patent lawyers, when I was a young lawyer and I finished law school and was very idealistic about the system still, I got into private practice and I was like, oh my God, this sucks. This isn't what it's supposed to be. And that's largely why I do what I do now. So that's kind of where I come at this from. So why don't we go around, everyone can introduce yourselves. If you want to also say a little bit like why you're interested. You guys we're putting you up to this, you can be more circumspect if you want. But I would love to hear. So why don't Robin?
Sure. I'm Professor Robin Feldman. I'm at the University of California, Hastings, and I direct the Institute for Innovation Law. We do a lot of empirical and theoretical research on patents these days, particularly patent trolls. We have a program called the Startup Legal Garage, where our students do free legal work for startup companies with their work supervised pro bono by outside companies.
I'm Brad Burnham. I work for a venture capital firm in New York. We have about 55 portfolio companies. About 25 of those are being sued, all over a business method or software patent, all by trolls, none by actual competitors, and in no case were any of the companies aware of the existence of the patent that they are being sued for. So that constitutes a problem in our lives. We spend a lot of time and energy trying to fight that off. We're very concerned that it's a completely asymmetrical war in the sense that it costs almost nothing to launch a suit, and it costs a great deal to defend one, and it makes it very convenient for software trolls to target startups who can't afford to put up the defense. So we see a pattern where they very often will test the waters by going after a startup who will settle for $25, $50, $100, $250,000, and then they use that money to work up the chain to just ever increasing stakes. And the bummer is that we end up being the front line. And the real bummer for American innovation or global innovation really is that it's the best and most brightest young companies that are taking advantage.
May I add something to that strategy? So once they've gotten licenses out of the smaller folks, then they sue the bigger folks and they go to court and they say the licenses are evidence that we have a rational basis for asserting our patent in this case. It's a great argument.
Paul Szymanski, I'm the general counsel of Automatic. We do operate WordPress.com, which is what we're best known for, but we also are very heavily involved in the WordPress open source software project. We do a lot of services and business around that. I'm a lawyer, but not a patent lawyer. I was at Gunderson for a while, which is a law firm in Silicon Valley for a while before that, doing corporate and startup M&A work mostly. So I kind of came at this problem by just sort of being on the receiving end of exactly what you're talking about, these sort of inbound patent troll suits, of which we've had a few, just like every other company. We're lucky in that we've sort of grown to a size where we can sort of start to mount a little bit more of a defense to these. But when I've been in groups of defendants along with other companies that are much smaller than us, and you see that firsthand, where it really is a threat to their existence. Whereas to us, we can fight a little bit more. And I think, just kind of seeing the strategy of the trolls firsthand is exactly what you're saying. They're using the weapons of the patent system and the litigation system to just extort settlements based on a patent that has no value. And I mean, to me, the interesting perspective I have is dealing with the trolls firsthand, but then also just internally, just kind of the dynamics of the company, just seeing how it impacts us kind of day to day, and like those conversations where you have to go into your CEO, your management team, the people that actually, built this product that 21% of the internet uses, and say, hey, somebody claims they invented this. They're like, what? Just the whole dialogue now of sort of the pro-patent troll lobby that's like, protect the innovator. I'm like, well, we're the innovators. Like, protect us from, protect us. So that just seeing kind of how all those pieces play out just in real life has been really kind of fascinating and troubling, and that's sort of why I've been, involved in trying to solve this problem.
Hello, Michael Norwood, and I'm actually started my career as a writer, writing Hollywood scripts, television and movie scripts, and books and things like that. And I was always represented by an agent, and originally in television, and then later on for books. And through some odd quirk of fate, I got into the technology field because my book series was popularized online through a popular newsletter. And I was looking for a better way to elicit comments from my readers. And so I hired some programmers to work with me for several years on developing an online software program. And before I started working with them, I filed for a patent. Because in Hollywood, when I was a kid and I first went out there, I was 19 years old, I would find that I'd get interviewed for hours by the different television studios, and I would never get paid for it, but the next year I'd see my ideas on television. So when I started in the tech industry, I looked at patents as just an important part of me just protecting what I'm doing. So I kind of come from this, sort of from both sides of the fence. I mean, as a small startup company, understanding that we have to be very careful about whatever type of technology that we're using, but I also come at it from the other standpoint because I have some valuable patents that I filed over the years, and it's like I've got to be afraid to raise my head above the line simply because there's got to be such a war there that, it's like everything is so polarized, and what I'm interested in is what is that median solution that both protects the inventors, because the abuses are on both sides of the fence, but at the same time protects the small company, the startup company, as we're all talking about, from frivolous suits that occur.
I'm Ethan Guillen. I work primarily on access to medicines through Patent Lens and do some trade work. I do work with the Medicines Patent Pool, which is the first patent pool in the medicine sector based on the tech sector model. And I'm here basically because there's a lot of overlapping issues in trade, and so I'm interested to hear more about thinking on patents from the tech side.
I'm actually really glad you're here too, because I think we could also be well served. Very knowledgeable about this area, but we could be well served by hearing some of the access to meds issues too. I think it informs the conversation, and it's largely been excluded from the popular current debate on that. So we're going to put you on the spot, so I hope you don't mind.
My name is Jeremy Glula. I'm a new staff technologist at EFF. And I'm mostly here to, my background is actually I did my PhD in robotics. And so I've definitely come more from the tech side of things. And I'm mostly just here to learn.
I got to follow the robot guy?
Yep, sorry.
I'm Michael McGarry. I'm the co-founder and chief political strategist for Engine, which, again, I'm very happy to have brought on my new boss here so that I can continue to learn and the organization can grow. But when we're talking about patents here today, the reason that our organization got involved, and a little bit of background, Engine is devoted to building better public policy alternatives from and for the startup community all around the United States. And patent trolls and reform of that kind of behavior is something that's causing a lot of sort of heartburn in a sense for that community. Brad talked about their portfolio companies. If you expand that out to the entire community throughout the country, it really does have a large-scale chilling effect in a macroeconomic sense on what we can do in terms of opportunity and growth in this country. So it's something that we needed to take on head on. We spent the better part of the last couple of years working on, first, what are the solutions coming from this community that we could amplify, and then trying to get congressional and regulatory partners on that. Now we're in a situation where this is a hot political issue, which is incredible to say in a patent sense, but so we're doing a lot of work, whether with Paul, who I've gone with to Washington on a number of occasions to talk to members of Congress, and Brad was just there last week, and of course Julie and the EFF, and a lot of our other sort of activist partners that are working on this, trying to get the ball now across the goal line. We had the House of Representatives pass a bill late last year. We're looking for the Senate to do the same, probably in the next month and a half, and hopefully we'll have something for the President to sign that will not be a silver bullet, and I think we'll go into a little bit more of this, but will help sort of at least ratchet back some of the behavior that we've seen from this community by attacking it in a very sort of open and sort of forward way. The problems that we're facing in terms of getting that done are from the small inventor community, which I love talking about that because I always sort of, see like the set of The Wizard of Oz with all these people running around inventing widgets. I don't know why, but there is this community which is largely held up by patent trolls themselves and universities working with them to try to stop the advancement of these fixes, whether it's the litigation reform pieces, whether it's openness in demand letters and throwing a little sunshine on that. And so that has been the sort of one sticking point we've seen, but there's been broad consensus in Washington, as well as some state jurisdictions which have taken action, which we think has been really important and interesting to try to stop this at even a lower level. But we are starting to see some of these sticking points, and it's important to see how we can continue to help that debate evolve and ultimately get something out from this Congress so we can start working then on what the longer term solutions are.
And we turn this into a little bit more of a conversation, so if you don't mind introducing.
No, my name is Ari Lespear of a firm called Archline based in New York. It's a consulting vehicle. I'm currently working with a company that does network security and data protection in Latin America, and we're exploring issues related to innovation and what happens to innovation in this world of patent trolls. It's a very small piece of the larger pie, but I'm curious to learn from you all.
Great. So we did have some things that people were going to talk about initially. Maybe we should still do that for a little bit. Maybe we can probably tighten up. Sure. But I just want to say one quick thing before we started. If people can think, one of the things that I've been trying to think a lot about lately personally is I think there's a very dangerous culture in our technology community, this desire to get as many patents as possible. And that's a much harder problem than the litigation problem. That's a much harder problem than the legislation problem, I should say. And so if while we're having this conversation, people kind of keep that in the back of their mind and help thinking about that, I think we can do a great good for the world if we could kind of shift that culture a bit. So anyway, I'm just going to throw that out there, and we're going to start with Robin. Who's going to talk a little bit about patent systems and basics.
So, as a professor in the group, I'll take my 6 minutes just to go over a little bit of the data of what's going on the ground out there. And let me offer the 2-second version of what Brad was talking about before, which is it starts with the fact that it's very difficult to tell what a patent covers. I'll talk about that if we want to. And it costs between $600,000 to $6 million to go to court to find out what a single patent covers. So if you are a computer company and I knock on your door and I say, I have a patent on gummy bear and you're infringing my patent. You say to me, infringing how? And I say, I actually don't have to tell you that. And by the way, if you don't like this one, I have 100 more in my pocket and we can keep playing this all day. So why don't you just take a license for a small amount and everything will be fine. That is the basic business model. There are a variety of approaches now that are different from that, but that's the core of the business model. It gets called NPE, non-practicing entities. It gets called PAE, patent assertion entities. It's called troll and other things that are more colorful. I tend to call them either NPEs or monetizers, and by that I mean those whose core activity is licensing or litigating patents as opposed to making products. And looking at the data, groups that are, please join us. We decided we were small enough that we would have a round table conversation or a round floor conversation, whatever that is. So this particular business model, and I will tell you, I'm very careful about using the term entity because there's so much money at stake. There's a huge amount of jockeying over what the definition is. One of the attempts to play with the definition is to seize on the word entity and say we leave out those who organize as trusts or individuals. I mean, if you look at the business model, that leads to some kind of silly results, but there's a lot of playing with the terms and what they mean. So those whose business model is licensing and litigating patents have had a dramatic impact on patent litigation. They filed about 25% of the lawsuits in 2007. They were up to almost 60% of the patent lawsuits in 2012. That's a huge rise. And that really represents the tip of the iceberg. If you look at the data in the White House report on patent assertion from last summer, 90% of the patent demands never get to a lawsuit. So most of the stuff is happening under the radar.
Do you have the
Please.
breakdown of the nature of the patents that are being asserted? I've heard a number that says something like 80% of the troll suits are asserting a business method or a software patent.
So this particular study that I was talking about that we did is 4 years and looked at 13,000 patent lawsuits. We did not break it down by the category. There's another one I'm going to get to shortly, but I'll jump to that now, which was a study of the patents asserted against startup companies. We were doing that by survey, so it's what people report. It's not as good as reading litigation, but that's all you can do because of non-disclosure agreements. So in that, we saw the largest group is indeed from information technology. That's software and business method patents. But 30% of the VCs we talked to said they had life science companies that had patent demands against them. And we're seeing them in moving, from the best data that I can see, it started in information technology, which translates into software and business method. It's moving more into Main Street, and then now the next frontier appears to be life sciences, and there's a variety of evidence that the large aggregators are beginning to amass life science patents.
And when you say that, you mean patents that are focused on the life science aspect of the business, not this. When you talk about Main Street, of course, the reason they became a target is because they oftentimes use software that's generally available.
I think that's right. So, but it's not only, I mean, you have it's all kinds of, Xerox machines, scanners, all of those things, whatever you have that's technology. But life sciences, we're talking about patents that are related to things like basic cloning technologies. We're talking about not just peripheral patents, but also patents about core molecule technology. So it will be interesting if you think of it in those ways to see how this plays out in the life science fields. It is not, I think there will be space for what you've talked about, which is to say, take business method patents and go after life science companies. But what's happening is it appears to be deeper than that. It's a different type. So I want to talk a little bit about who's getting sued and where the money's going and where it's coming from. The majority of NPE lawsuits are filed against small businesses. And I'm not talking about the recent rise of sort of the attacks on mom and pop stores. This data goes back much farther than that. The majority of these lawsuits are filed against small businesses with revenues under $10 million, which is consistent with your experience of who you target. The precise figures are difficult to come by, but Professors Besson and Moyer estimate that patent demands, we're talking not just the lawsuits, but all demands, cost U.S. companies $29 billion in 2011. And the next statistic is what I think of as really important. It's what economists are calling the leaky bucket. And that is that very little of that money flows back to inventors or to innovation. So it's only an estimated 20% of the money that goes to NPEs in any form flows back to the original inventor who made the patent and sold it to the NPE, or gets put into internal R&D by the non-practicing entity itself. So if you're someone who cares about innovation, this is a very troubling figure.
And is that because they've made agreements to take pennies on the dollar, or simply?
Yes. Yes, I think that's it. It's also, though, some of the structures of non-practicing entities are extraordinarily complicated. There are many of these that are structured by very sophisticated lawyers, but also lawyers who are sophisticated in the venture world and how funds are organized. And so their structure is such that very little of it goes to the inventor from whom they purchased it. And I have heard the head of the largest aggregator say, we're not that good at making products. That's not what we do. So, we've done a little bit of R&D here and there. We spun off some companies. That's not really what we do, so that's not what we do. And I think the best that we can figure out is that's accurate. The problem in studying this area is that Most of the interactions are covered by very strict non-disclosure agreements. So you have legal silence. And then you also have a general sense of terror. But people don't want anyone to know that they are a potential client of an NPE. And so there's a high degree of fear and sensitivity, makes it very hard to get accurate data in here. Let me just skip ahead. So one of the things that we have tried to do is what I call data-driven lawmaking, and that is to test and challenge some of the narratives that are out there. You all have been talking about some of them. So there was one narrative that's been circulating in Washington that the NPE model is good for innovation because venture capitalists might be able to monetize patents if a startup company fails. They might be able to sell to non-practicing entities, and that possibility is attracting venture capital into the startup community. So I did a study of VCs and their portfolio companies, and I looked at a variety of things I'll talk about, but on that question itself, the venture capital community itself strongly disagreed. So I asked the VCs, when you're making funding decisions, do you consider the potential for selling patents to patent assertion entities if the company fails? And the overwhelming majority said they don't. They don't consider it. It doesn't matter to them. It's not attracting capital. And in general, both the VCs and the startup companies said that they don't see this activity as positive for the startup community. 70% of the venture capitalists who responded have startup companies that have received patent demands. And then if you look at the portfolio companies, 1 in 3 portfolio companies has received patent demands. And this study, and then there are other patent startup studies by Professor Colleen Chen, they show that the costs can run into the millions of dollars, although it's much cheaper if you choose to capitulate early. You can get out at a much smaller amount. What I consider more important, and I'll turn to that for the last couple of minutes here, is what I call the human toll, especially in small companies and startup companies. And there are some amazing quotes. This is from Professor Chen's startup study. It was agonizing to hand over all the money we had earned from a product we had invented and created ourselves to a firm that invents nothing and creates nothing. Our founder has since lost his house, car, and all his assets. There were a lot of comments like this. In the same vein, one company said the following: we spent millions pretty much to settle pretty much spurious claims. The common approach that these entities took is make a claim, try to defend it as best they could, eventually offer to settle by observing that it would cost us $3 to $5 million to fight and we might lose, versus the $2 to $3 million they offered to settle. We'd work to negotiate them down to $1 to $2 million, we'd hold our nose and we would pay. So in addition to the human toll, it doesn't take fancy economics to understand the implications for innovation. And to paraphrase one VC, when companies are spending time and money responding to patent demands, they're not inventing and they're not hiring. So I want to close with one additional thought that addresses some of the issues that you raise, and that is that the patent system, I believe, is tremendously important for innovation and for giving startup companies a platform to build from. And rights are not useful if you can't enforce them. Along the same lines, monetization, in theory, could serve very positive economic ends. It could provide market mechanisms so people who have inventions could connect with those who could transfer those inventions and create products out of them. The way it's playing out at the moment, however, is troubling and nothing like that. The opportunities for anti-competitive behavior and deceptive practices are rampant. For the most part, it's operating as a tax on current products rather than as a mechanism for bringing forth new products, new innovation. And to me, that's the perspective that we should worry about the most. Thank you.
Thank you. And actually goes perfectly to Brad, who is a VC. But you can tell me whether you disagree with that. I'd love to, to talk a little bit about that and what Robin said and your experience has been, but also if you can hit on this, there is this perception, I think, in the venture capital community that people feel like VCs will only invest if you have a patent, or I know you guys, Brad and your partners tend to be the exception to that, but I think we have a problem in the community, so you can talk about both those things.
Okay, so the problem with using us as an example is that we invest in a very specific and very narrow thing. We invest in essentially consumer-facing web services or networks, and those networks are all defined by software, and So the only patents that any of our companies would be applying for, if they were to apply for patents, would be software. We don't do biotech, we don't do nanotech, we don't do material science, we don't do robotics, we don't do, we don't do any of that. So I think we have, as a result, we do not encourage our companies to apply for patents. We think that the patent life cycle, or the life, the 7 years that it would take to get approval, in those 7 years, the chances that you will have succeeded or failed are almost 100%. I mean, you will either have succeeded or failed before the patent issues. So the only thing that applying for the patent does is give you some residual value if you fail, if you believe there is residual value. And unfortunately, the only way that there is residual value is if it trades to somebody who's going to do really unethical things with it. So now you have a problem with whether or not you want to go there. I feel like we don't need to, and as much as I'm tempted to, and as Mike said, I was in Washington last week talking to senators mostly in a session that they set up, and it was just so easy to get them to put their hands up and say, okay, I give up, I get it, I understand there's a problem, but tell me what the solution is, right? Because if you tell some of the stories that we told, like we have one company that was doing 10 million in revenue, 70 people employed, and they were hit by 2 patent trolls in a row. And unfortunately, this is the entity question. These were contingency lawyers working with actually defunct venture capital firms and trying to recover some asset value in the defunct portfolio companies. And so there wasn't, but they weren't classic trolls in either case. But in both cases, they were asserting a kind of ridiculous patent. In one case, it was and we see a lot of these patents. Does anybody remember the old cop shows when you used to do a composite sketch by sliding a piece of paper that had an eyes and a nose and a mouth, right? Well, there's a company that claims to have invented that. They didn't actually invent that because, of course, people have been doing that for 1,000 years. They invented doing it on a computer. So, and they were able to assert a patent saying, anybody who does eyes, nose, and mouth on a computer. Well, the problem is that our little company was a marketing services company that was doing creative social media marketing campaigns for big brands. And so they would allow you to create your own avatar to represent you in these social media campaigns. And so you could pick an eyes and a nose and a mouth to create your avatar, right? It's not, it's not law enforcement. It's not sold to police departments. It was doing something that had absolutely nothing to do with the original company. But because of the way software patents are written, you could say, well, you're changing out eyes and nose and mouth on a computer. We invented that.
And I would bet that patent didn't say anything, only said the process of changing things on a computer to bring a composite photo. In other words, nothing about how you would actually do that, just the idea.
Correct. And so it gets crazier. And to that point, I'm going to mix things up just to make it a little easier. They were sued by a second. The other thing that this company could do is they could allow you to put your face in an ad. So GM has a new car that comes out. They have a video, and you can put your face in the ad driving the new car and send it to all your friends. Okay. Well, there was a company that had a technique for back in Sesame Street days in VHS you could send something in and you could have your kid play with Barney on a video, right? So and so this was the second patent that we were sued by. The thing that took the company out of business is that the troll in this case sued not just our company, but they sued their customers. And so you had Cadillac and American Express going, what the fuck? This is an uncapped liability. You're telling me I might be on the hook for millions of dollars, and all I was doing was running a little marketing campaign, and so I'm out. I'm gone. And so they went from 10 million to 3 million in revenue in about a month, and run rates. And all the pending business dried up, and they had to lay everybody off, and then they hung in for another 6 months, and then they went out of business. And so, and in that second suit, the irony was, not only did they not say how they did it, right, but they actually, in trying to negotiate a settlement with the company, which the company ultimately agreed with, but it was too late to save the company. Part of the settlement was, you give us the technology to do the thing that we claim to have invented, because we were doing it. We knew how to do it, and we were actually doing it with a very sophisticated 3D modeling technology that allowed for you to put an actual 3D representation of a face into a 3D video in a much more sophisticated way than they'd ever executed. So we invented all this technology to actually do it, and they couldn't do it, so we agreed to give them the technology to do the thing that they had invented. So those horror stories are too easy, right? And because there are just so many of them out there. And all of the lawmakers kind of came back and said, I know it's a problem, tell us how to solve the problem, which is why I think we have to address Mike's problem. Because a lot of them came back and said, we're hearing that if we make these fixes, that independent inventors will be hurt. And I have to say that I don't have any evidence that any independent inventors are actually prosecuting business and business method and software patents or asserting them. But I'm sure that they are. But I also, the tricky part for me is that a lot of these patents were issued, in the early days when software patents first were allowed, when the patent office had no idea what to do with it. And so they assumed, well, if you do it on a computer, it's novel, right? And they granted a patent which should never have been granted. One of the solutions is something called covered business method patent review, which is what Chuck Schumer is proposing. And what that would do is allow a person who is sued by one of these patents to say, before we pursue this suit, let's just confirm that it's a good patent. And that would put it back into an accelerated review process at the patent office. And the question is, would that separate good patents from bad patents? Now that we have 15 years of experience of bad patents being asserted, and we can see how obvious that is, would we do a better job of recognizing that problem? And would we, well, it turns out that almost everybody who is in the business of asserting patents hates that idea, because it turns out that 80% of the business method patents that are reviewed are found invalid. And so if I'm in the business of asserting patents, I don't want that. But if I'm actually a real inventor with a real patent, and I'm confident that I actually invented something, I shouldn't be afraid of that. But
we're actually doing that right now ourselves.
You're doing a CBM?
Well, I don't know the technical name for it, but we're actually putting it through a second review ourselves.
Yeah, EFF has done a bunch of those too.
You're paying for a second review? You're doing what?
No, we found some prior art that intersected with ours. And so we need to acknowledge that, so we're requesting an accelerated review in order to narrow our own claims regarding the patents.
So it used to be more common that people would put their own patents back into review because it actually makes your patent stronger when it comes out. I hear that less now because I think people feel like they have these runaway patents, much like you talk about. But of course, the Supreme Court is taking up some of these questions this term, and I'm cautiously optimistic that Congress is only so politically brave. They will only do so much. I think the court very well may go farther. I'm hopeful the court may go farther. We could do.
If you end up with this kind of patent review, can the patent office handle this? How many more patents would then be? If you put all software.
Well, it's kind of self-funding.
Business.
It's kind of self-funding because it's much cheaper than litigation to do this type of review.
Yeah, I'm talking about the patent office though.
So the White House this morning announced that it would like to have all fees from the PTO captured and held within the PTO, which would be an addition of $400 million. That should.
It would like to.
It would like to. I mean, I obviously I read it. I listened to it as I'm coming in here, so I can't tell you.
It would like to, and actually that's what ought to happen if the PTO is a fee-funded agency that starts out the appropriations process. But that isn't what happens in the normal course.
Well,
of
the Patent Office has been in the past, and the AIA, the American Invents Act, actually, the only sticking point when the House and the Senate came to reconcile the two bills, which was I think 3 years ago now, was this capturing funding. But it was right at the height of the debt ceiling arguments, which totally unrelated to patents, but that's what kind of won the day. But there are some more bills pending, and the White House supports them to keep the funds in. The Patent Office is one of the only government agencies that's in the black. It actually makes a ton of money. It's just a matter of being able to keep the money.
It's two questions. One is, do they have the money? So that is, in the political game, as I understand it, that's an important first step towards moving towards it, and hopefully that is where it will go. I don't want to say that's where it will end up, but I think that's the announcement this morning was a critical piece. The second question is, do they have the capacity, even if they have the money? And that's a trickier question. There are questions about how effective the PTO is, how captured it is by the patent industry, the patent making industry itself, and the incentive structures within it. So there are issues. Yeah, and those are continuing concerns.
I think one other quick thing I'd like to comment, that both of you said something that both kind of talked about this definition of entities problem, and I think some opponents of reform in DC have been like, oh, you can't define a troll, so we can't do this. And I think that's total BS. I don't think you need to define a troll. I think the important thing for these conversations is that you define certain crappy behavior. And the kind of legislative proposals we're seeing that we are optimistic about, and after Paul talks, Mike will also talk about those a little bit, they get at certain behaviors, not certain people. And I think that's a very important distinction, and saying that you can't define a troll for purposes of holding up reform is a dangerous sideshow, because we don't need to define a troll to define what is and what isn't appropriate.
And those sideshows, and I'll talk a little more about this, those sideshows are popping up left and right right now.
So I'm going to turn to Paul, and I'm hoping you can give a little bit, perspective from inside our company.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, Brad has had some of this experience maybe as a board member and an advisor to a lot of these companies. I've had the experience kind of day to day of dealing with it. So I'm the, in-house counsel for a company. We're about 200 people, 250 people right now. When I started, we were about half that. And I think we're, that actually puts us well ahead of the game in terms of all the other startups out there who don't have any lawyers. They may have outside counsel, but anytime you talk to them, of course, the meter is running. So it was my job. We haven't had a lot of patent troll suits, fortunately, but we've had a few. And you really get to see just from, the few that we have had, the tactics, and really, how the trolls are actually leveraging the system to get what they want, and then how it impacts us as a company, and especially as engineers and people that should be doing things other than depositions, and me, who should be doing other things than dealing with patent trolls. Kind of to start off with, I mean, as you were saying, the kind of complaints that you get, the actual form of the demand or the form of the complaint. With one of our lawsuits, I mean, there wasn't preceded by any demand letter. We just got the complaint, and it was a copy of the patent, 4 screenshots of our website, and that was it. It was like 7 pages, 4 pages long, and then a copy of the patent. And then soon after that, there was a letter saying, you may have seen our lawsuit, you can make this go away for, I think it was $4.5 million or something like that. Yeah. So please, let's start this settlement dialogue. And I mean, that number isn't just pulled out of thin air. I mean, that closely correlates to the number that it would cost us to hire our own outside counsel and go through the whole process, and and win. Actually, if we were to win and to invalidate the patent, that's the price of admission, the price to kind of play that game. So really, from our standpoint, from my standpoint, was a couple of things. It was, number one, minimize the cost, which means small, check that we're writing to outside counsel and or the patent troll. I mean, I don't really see those two amounts as really all that different, frankly. It's money out of the company for making this go away, honestly. Like, it really didn't, that was sort of the top line.
But one's much quicker than the other.
Exactly, and I think, but that plays into the second cost, which is...
One may set precedent.
Possibly. I mean, and that's sort of the thing, strategically, that definitely is a consideration. And I think the other piece of the cost, which is maybe just as important, if not more so, is just the cost to us as a business of the distraction. And having only one lawyer and a bunch of inventors really that develop the technology that is at issue, trying to shield them really from something that I just viewed as a complete waste of time.
I don't think a lot of people understand. I remember being shocked when I learned how much time it can take of engineer time if you do engage in that process and what discovery needs. So you just
and that's a really good point, because I think that's the thing I was very focused on is and the trolls are as well, because cost of litigation when you talk about it is 80-90% discovery, and that's the troll's weapon, frankly. I mean, it's the cost you have to pay to lawyers to go through the discovery process and the cost in terms of time of your people. And so it's in their interest to make that as painful for you as possible. I think a normal case where there's something actually at issue and there's discovery kind of equally on both sides, the parties will sort of, there's sort of a détente there. They're like, hey, we're not going to make this, terribly painful for the other party because they can just do the same to us. And as you were saying at the beginning, I mean, it's completely asymmetrical in the troll lawsuit. So they had a list of 40 people they wanted to depose on our side, and there's no one to depose on the troll. So there's one guy, who's the inventor. So, I mean, we would get, probably in the heat of it, we would get, I would say, about 5 to 7 letters a day demanding different things, scheduling depositions. If you don't write back to them the next day, you get 5 more letters. And this would go on, and their intention is really just to harass, to intimidate, and to drive up your costs, because I would have to send each one of those letters to our lawyer to read them and to write back. And that just, if they can drive up that cost and they can front load it on you as much as possible in the process, that's their leverage. And so,
I'm sorry, I'm laughing because I know of one lawyer who sent back an email that said, perhaps you should find a pen pal abroad.
yeah.
And I'm laughing because I have PTSD from being an associate, a litigation associate in your law firm.
And I think it's interesting because we had a very specific way of kind of going about this, but we were in these defense groups. One of the things we try to do is kind of join with all the other companies that are being sued and kind of consolidate under a single counsel. It's a very difficult thing to do, just because it turns sort of into a prisoner's dilemma, where some of the companies are much smaller and they have a different incentive to try to get out of the case early. And then from my standpoint, especially when it's your first couple of patent cases, you're saying to yourself, well, it might be cheaper to settle this now, but I don't want this to be on the record showing that you could send a complaint in to us, in the first. And a month later you get a check back. It's like an ATM. I definitely don't want that. So, I mean, that's sort of the interesting question, I'd have for you, is just sort of seeing this as a little more broader scale. What do you tell companies to do? Do you say, is it worth it to fight these things? Is it worth it to not?
And do you and your partners, on the converse, the sort of counterfactual of the innovation is helped by patent trolls argument, you go to these prospective companies that are coming and pitching you and saying, we'd love to invest, but we think a patent troll is going to come after you here, here, and here, and we've seen that with 9 other companies, so we need to ease back. Do you see that? I mean, it's the chilling effect question at a certain point.
So the answer to the first question is we don't really tell them one way or the other. I mean, first of all, we're minority investors. We don't control the companies.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, founders have different personalities. We just had, this could seem completely unrelated, but another form of extortion that's popping up these days is DDoS attacks. Mm-hmm. And they're sending letters, and it's exactly the same phenomenon. I can front load the cost to you. I can let you out for X, but then you're creating that ATM machine. The minute somebody sees that, that's a real problem. And so we've had one company who was hit with a DDoS attack and was offered an out for $450. And they said no, and they just agreed to refund everybody that was hurt by this. It'll cost them $250,000 to refund everybody. But they said, no, I'm not going to pay $450 to this extortionist. Yeah. So that's a personality thing. We have another company, actually this company that actually ultimately went out of business, was run by very pragmatic people who were just trying to get out, and they were constantly negotiating, and they just couldn't negotiate fast enough to come up with a deal to get out. And so we don't tell them which way. And then the second question was,
Do you advise when you're trying to pick your companies?
no, because having had the experience of being sued by somebody who was in criminal justice selling enterprise software when I was doing marketing services for consumers, where do you start to look? You couldn't possibly cover the landscape and say, oh, that's not going to work. So we just pay no attention.
There's an interesting paper by Tim Lee and Christina Mulligan from Yale. They talk about scaling the patent system. And I think they put out the paper a little bit too early in this larger debate, which is unfortunate because I think it's a very helpful conversation. And the idea is that so many of these patents are so hard to understand, so crappy, just say on the computer or on the internet. But we're literally talking about tens of, if not hundreds of thousands, that even if you could read them and try and get some idea to assess your risk, you actually couldn't because of the sheer number. Right.
It's not a bad one. Can I answer your chilling effect one? Because there is some data for that. So when you do surveys, you really get a 100% answer. I got a 100% answer on chilling effect. The question of VCs was, if you were thinking of investing in a company and it had a patent suit against that, would that be a deterrent to you? And half said it would be a deterrent on its face, and half said it could be a deterrent. They'd have to look further. You just don't usually get.
That's a situation where there's a known.
Exactly, a known.
Right.
Exactly.
The known unknown is not the unknown.
Yeah, that's different from yours. But in terms of if you got one on there, that's.
And of course, the trolls know the right moments to appear, right? Before a round of funding, before you go public, some moment where you are vulnerable to.
So to be fair, I have looked into that, and I can't find. I mean, I can find individual ones where that's happened, but not systemic.
Oh, really?
So they don't seem to have picked that up as the core of what they're doing yet. At least that's.
Don't give them any ideas.
But there are some.
I was going to say, Julie, this is the first time you've ever given a patent troll
10%.
too much credit.
Well, I think that was more.
Anecdotally, we get hit at those moments.
Right.
Yes, and that's what I expect.
Between the time an acquisition is announced and it closes, between the time that a new funding round is in the works, we do get hit at those moments.
So I looked at the within a year of when you got your funding. And so we looked at that first year. Did you get something right there? And there were only 11% who had worked.
The problem is, if you need to look at the difference between funding between Series B and Series C. Because if you look at Series A, they're too small to even be known, right? So I said 25 of our 55 companies have been sued. The ones that haven't been sued have 4 people and a dog.
That's interesting.
And they've raised $1 million, and they're not on anybody's radar.
And also, let me just answer that. More of the ones that I had were sued in the 4 people in a dog stage, pre-funding. In other words, they're just not, the trolls don't seem to be looking that hard.
Well, we get those too. We get these the mass mailings where we had one company that was sued as a consumer of a processor that one of the Acacia was going after. And we literally had no sales at that point, no sales. So that the damages would be 0, right? But we got the letter and we had to spend $25,000, dealing with the letter.
I don't mean to suggest it's not there. I just mean it's not a systemic pattern yet that they.
And it's the same. It's a much smaller sample set, obviously, with companies going public.
Yeah. So I've just looked at all the companies that I've reached out to. All the companies had an IPO in the last 5 years. And of the ones that have gone back again, you can find it anecdotally, but it's not widespread. Every time I look at this data, I worry about publishing it because I worry it's going to get very effective.
Okay, so we have 15 minutes left. I want Mike to give a quick overview of kind of where we are. So if you try and keep it to about 5 minutes, because I do want to
absolutely
this conversation.
Well, and I think part of this conversation has focused on where we've been in terms of building the patent system. That we've moved from commoditization to weaponization. What we're trying to do is forestall getting to where Skynet is self-aware with the patent system a little bit, and we need to find détente and disarmament in the patent system. That's where the politics of this comes in. As I said in the open, the House has passed mostly a litigation reform bill. The Senate will take up in the course of the next month or so a very similar package. And these are things like fee shifting, bonding has been discussed, caps on discovery, lots of legal behavior that the trolls are using this is an attempt to try to, again, forestall that behavior. There's also one other piece that was not involved in the House side bill, which is demand letter.
Again, it's in
a little bit, but this is a much broader attack. There was a jurisdictional issue in the House, so now we have the opportunity to do this in 2 committees in the Senate, and I think we can have a little bit broader package here, which will help. None of this is a silver bullet. As Julie talks about, there's issues before the Supreme Court, one or two cases? Four cases before the Supreme Court that are that may in fact go further depending on how the court rules, which your guess is as good as anybody's. But from a political standpoint, this is a solid attempt by members of Congress who very rarely understand an issue as technical and wonky as this one, to try to get at the root of the problem. But it's not a silver bullet. The CBM program is something that, and attacking patent quality generally, and supporting PTO and making sure they have the adequate funding to get good patents moving into the system, are things that we're going to have to move on as well. It may happen in this process. We may have to do it as step 2 or step 3 and beyond, depending on how some of the inner workings and the deals shake out in the cloakroom, mainly. But we're at a point now where there's general consensus, as Brad noted, among senators that there is a problem, we need to do something to fix it. But the voices that are more prevalent in that community, in Congress right now, are the small inventors, the universities, people that are either propped up by the trolls themselves or are making money through licensing deals that don't want to see that being harmed. And they're dangling the idea of the tinkerer in his garage making a widget who is now not going to be able to defend his patent. There is nothing in either the House or the Senate package that would move forward that would stop a small inventor from being able to assert their patent. All we're asking people to do is to be able to speak more technically about the patent they own, where it is exactly being infringed and why, and then to move into that process. Overall, it is a deterrent to a scurrilous business practice that needs to be stopped because it's costing $29 billion in 2011, and I can tell you that number went up over the last couple of years. These are all meant to disarm, deter this kind of practice. Patent trolling is great work if you can stomach it, right? Because it's a letter and then you get a $25,000 check. We need to figure out the political way of making that less attractive to bad actors who are in a system taking advantage of loophole. These are ways to do it, but our community needs to be more involved. We've sent Brad to Washington. I keep going there with Paul. We're going to send people back to try to keep the drumbeat going. But the fact of the matter is, Qualcomm and the patent trolls and the universities, they have K Street lobbyists. And they're there, they're at the cocktail parties, they're at the fundraisers, they're at the kids' softball games, they're taking staffers out on a Wednesday night. People in our community, we're building things, we're building products, and so it's a little harder for us to get away, but over the next couple of months we're going to have to, because if we do, it's the first step to stopping this, and I think we're getting there.
Yeah, and actually, Rob,
Sorry, can I give a different perspective? And I appreciate that perspective very much, because just even in my own company, we were building an email replacement system, and there was a little feature that I saw on Google that I thought, oh, this would be really cool to put in our system. Then I suddenly said, oh my gosh, if we include this feature, then we can get sued by Google. But then in the process of finding out what are fair and reasonable licensing fees, found out that typically 2 to 5% of the value that particular invention adds to to what the overall system is. And I said, well, that would be totally fair, because if this portion of the invention was accounting for, say, 1% of the entire thing that we're doing, and you take 2 to 5% of the revenue of that, I said, well, that would be fair. The problem from the inventor standpoint is this: if you have an invention, and we've avoided going through the intermediaries right now, the MPs, the trolls, exactly because it's just such a, in Steve Jobs' word, it's thermonuclear war, and who wants to get involved with that when your main concern is you're an innovator, you want to invent. But from the inventor standpoint, there's a huge problem that's not talked about here, and what that is is if you don't have some intermediary to act for you, and you go to a company who is legitimately using software that you've developed or an idea that you've developed, then there's something called a declaratory judgment. And you probably can explain that better than I do. But basically the idea is just by even approaching them, you can be slapped with a declaratory judgment, and you, the inventor, lands up being put into court. And also not having a legal group or a law firm representing you, suddenly you're in the same position you're all saying that you're in, which is totally legitimate. I understand that viewpoint. But from the opposite side of the fence, the inventor is in that same position. So the only alternative then is to go through the MPE. Because you put years of your life, if you have a venture capitalist who's funding you, then you've gotten back financially, but perhaps you've put your own home on the line. Perhaps you've put your whole life's fortune into developing a piece of software. And then suddenly you find that other people are using it, and you don't want to stop them, but you want to be able to collect at least something for the years of work that you put into something that you've sort of been moved away out of the market from being able to capitalize on. So the question is, what's the fair thing to do? And
so I think the answer to that is, you're talking about a problem, and for small inventors, and they're in a tough spot. And so what I would say is, the analogy is, I'm in a tough spot, but I don't want to go to a loan shark, because that's not going to make life better for me or for society. I think, answering your earlier question, which is, now that we agree there's a problem, how do we fix it? I think the focus has to be on products, on on incentives, on business models, on legal recognition of those who are making products. I think that is just a founding principle for all of these different initiatives. We could start from that. I think we'd go a long way.
I'm actually really
But you're not answering Mike's question, because he's saying he's making a product, and he can't afford to defend the product.
Right. So I'm saying, so here's what I would say. If you have, so what I would like to see is the development of intermediaries related to the development of products. What you have now are intermediaries related to skimming off the top.
Yeah.
So if the patent system is focused on, are there products coming out of this, disadvantaging those who are not making products, those intermediaries go away, and you get new intermediaries that can solve your problem.
And I agree with that, and I absolutely believe that. I mean, for the last year, I've sort of been building a brain trust of people around me to help solve this problem for us as a company. Coming from the opposite perspective, but from the same perspective, in that we're developing software and understanding that there are so many abuses in the industry. But you're also getting at the very basis of why the U.S. patent system was founded the way it was founded. You had the British system prior to the 1600s or 1700s that was based primarily in it being a product-driven company that actually filed for patents. And when the U.S. system got put into place, it was put into place specifically to allow the smaller people who didn't necessarily have the ability to bring their product to market to nevertheless protect themselves on the ideas that they had, and then go to a company and say, hey, this is the idea that we have, and how can we work with you in some way, shape, or form? It was like me when I was a kid, 19, 20 years old, going off to Hollywood, getting interviewed by these studios. I had no protection, and I got taken advantage of exactly in that scenario. Likewise, as an inventor, how do you prevent your, going to a company who can find very valid use of your invention?
I want to try and do something here, because I want to understand. I want to challenge the whole notion that we should be patenting software.
Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah.
Right?
I'm kind of with you.
And so the other argument that you often hear is that the reason for a patent is that there's an enormous amount of time and cost associated with creating something new, and that if it can just be ripped off tomorrow, then nobody's going to invest that time and energy to do it. Software has this really weird characteristic where it's not a pharmaceutical. It's not going through 10 years of drug trials. It's really the embodiment of an idea, right? And the question is, and it's in a funny way, it's a little bit related to how you were ripped off in Hollywood. You came to Hollywood with ideas, and they weren't protected, and you're coming to the software world with ideas, and you're trying to figure out how to protect those. And I just wonder if we should, as a society, be protecting those.
Well, actually, you said something wonderful in the seminar yesterday. You boiled down the whole ID management issue to one single word, which is trust. And, you know, it's kind of like, what was the famous saying with my Roosevelt? Trust and verify or something like that.
That was Reagan.
Trust but verify.
Okay, maybe I'm thinking of the big stick.
Whatever.
But there's got to be some intermediary thing, because the truth of the matter is that there are plenty of companies who will take advantage of a smaller company or a smaller inventor. When I first got involved with tech, there was somebody who I wanted to get involved with, and so I started to tell him about the software that we were producing, and he wasn't satisfied that I was. He wanted me to disclose the whole 9 yards to him. So he said to me, he says, well, what's to stop me from just taking what you told me already and producing it myself? And I said, well, a little thing called patent that I filed. And so that saved me in that particular instance.
So couldn't you also use the non-disclosure agreement?
I also had a non-disclosure agreement. I did have a non-disclosure agreement with him. But non-disclosure agreements are also very nebulous things.
But either way, you've got to go to court.
Even to get somebody to sign a non-disclosure agreement, you have to disclose what you're going to disclose to them, or at least give some sense of it. So it is a very tricky thing for somebody who's inventing something from being able to talk about it and yet not have it being.
So in the examples of our companies that are being sued, we would have been completely protected if there was something called an independent inventor's defense. So in no case did anybody ever disclose anything to any one of our companies, and this is all 25, or actually it's more like 45 suits of 25 companies. In no case was there any contact between the company and the person suing beforehand. In no case was there any exchange of information beforehand, right? These are all out of the blue.
Yeah.
So and so what's happening here is that there's a certain need that emerges in the market. 5, 6 people realize, okay, we've got to solve this problem. They come up with different ways of solving the problem, and one of them has applied for a patent and basically argues that all the others should not be able to do it, right? So but if you had an independent invention defense, you'd say, well, we had no contact, we had no awareness. This was not published at the time we invented or we created, so we shouldn't be prescribed from doing it, right? But that's a tricky problem.
Yeah, politically we don't get there, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I think one thing that I think is important to just for a little bit of color here, because especially this is an international angle, we have a one-size-fits-all system in America, and it's largely because of international agreements, one in particular called TRIPS, a much longer conversation for another day. But I personally believe that one of the biggest problems with our system is that one-size-fits-all doesn't make sense. The way pharmaceuticals deal with patents should not be how software deals with patents. Something very simple to think of, like, a 20-year patent on a piece of software is insane.
They're just ontologically different beings. So.
Right. Unfortunately, that's kind of the way things are. But I think that's a really big problem. We have about really no time left.
Can I just add, just as the academic in the room, the narrative you gave about the patent history and its logic, there are problems in that narrative. It's not 100% accurate, just to give you a heads up on that. Your declaratory judgment description, dead on. But the history of the patents, it doesn't quite go like that.
Maybe you can clarify this too, but from the company side.
Can we have other voices?
Yeah, sure, sorry. I said way too much, and you're absolutely right. Please, do you have...
I have points. I don't want to say just for me if other people have points.
No, but I want to hear, I do. I think you have a very interesting perspective that hasn't really been discussed in this.
Just to say a couple things. I was very interested that you were mentioning that the tech industry is largely absent from these debates. I work mainly in the international realm, like on trade agreements and at WIPO, and I always see the pharma, glitzy wine and dine party, and then there's like the MPA A1, but none of these negotiators are hearing about the perspective from sort of new tech, right? Intel and IBM and Microsoft are there. And in large part, it's because of these agreements that the US system ends up being reified. So there's a lot of things we can't go back on and test to think oh, maybe we should try and do things a little bit differently, because that means deconstructing the system that's now been made global through the World Trade Organization. And so I would be interested to see more interaction with tech as an industry, because like access to medicines, we're totally losing out, right? Like pharma has like lockdown on that, and so the implications go both ways. You know, and like when debates are going on in South Africa, which I imagine one day would probably be an important market for you folks. South Africa doesn't even have an examination system. If you file the paperwork, they just give you a stamp and you have a patent, right? So there are like orders of magnitude more patents on everything in South Africa. And I imagine as the legal system develops there, you're gonna have a much bigger problem there. And I would imagine you're gonna see like the major market of Africa and the trendsetter for Africa having a much better system. So engagement from tech there, the engagement right now is mainly from pharma in the negative sense of trying to kill the reforms. And so I think that there could, tech and access to medicines people could be better allies. It's just that we don't understand each other very well and we don't interact a lot. And I'd like to see more interaction.
Well, I wonder if there's some sort of connection there to Julie's point as well about, you know, we should treat software patents differently. The South African system is obviously only 20 years old. I mean, it's got a much longer backlog, but the system that's in place is 20 years old. Maybe there's an opportunity to strengthen the needs where you need them and to make sure that we could help create a system there. I'm volunteering to go to South Africa because I used to live there and love the country, but I think there's a way to possibly use it as a system in transition, a system that's being built to, you know, not take up the entirety of the New Zealand example of like, oh, software patents, not anymore. Next.
Well, but Europe also is much more comfortable with software patents, and they don't really have it.